Civil war. Tiqqun. Whoever does not take sides in a civil war is struck with infamy and loses all rights to politics. Solon, the Constitution of Athens. 1. The elementary human unity is not the body, the individual, but the form of life. 2. The form of life is not beyond bare life. It is its intimate polarization. 3. Each body is affected by its form of life, as if by a clinamen, a leaning, an attraction, a taste. A body leans toward whatever leans its way. This goes for each and every situation. Inclinations go both ways. Gloss. To the inattentive observer, it may seem that Bloom offers a counter-example, a body deprived of every penchant and inclination, and immune to all attractions. But on closer inspection, it is clear that Bloom refers less to an absence of taste than to a specific taste for absence. Only this penchant can account for all the efforts Bloom makes to persevere in Bloom, to keep what leans his way at a distance, in order to decline all experience. Like the religious, who, unable to oppose another worldliness to this world, must convert their absence within the world into a critique of worldliness in general, Bloom tries to flee from a world that has no outside. In every situation, he responds with the same disengagement, each time slipping away from the situation. Bloom is therefore a body distinctively affected by a proclivity toward nothingness. 4. This taste, this clinamen, can either be warded off or embraced. To take on a form of life is not simply to know a penchant. It means to think it. I call thought that which converts a form of life into a force, into a sensible effectivity. In every situation, there is one line that stands out among all others, the line along which power grows. Thought is the capacity for singling out and following this line. A form of life can be embraced only by following this line, meaning that all thought is strategic. Gloss. To latecomers' eyes like ours, the conjuring away of every form of life seems to be the West's peculiar destiny. Paradoxically, in this civilization that we can no longer claim as our own without consenting to self-liquidation, conjuring away forms of life most often appears as a desire for form. Search for an archetypal resemblance, an idea of self placed before or in front of oneself. Admittedly, this will to identity, wherever it has been fully expressed, has had the hardest time masking the icy nihilism and the aspiration to nothingness that forms its spine. But the conjuring away of forms of life also has a minor, more cunning form called consciousness, and at its highest point, lucidity. 2 virtues. They prize all the more because these virtues render bodies increasingly powerless. At that point, one starts to call lucidity the knowledge of this weakness that offers no way out. Taking on a form of life is completely different from the striving of the consciousness or the will, or from the effects of either. Actually, to assume a form of life is a letting go, an abandonment. It is at once fall and elevation, a movement and a staying within oneself. 5. My form of life relates not to what I am, but to how I am what I am. Gloss. This statement performs a slight shift in the direction of a taking leave of metaphysics. Metaphysics is not a philosophical imperative, but a physiological necessity. Having now reached the end point of its deployment, metaphysics gathers itself into a planetary injunction to absence. What empire demands is not that each conforms to a common law, but that each conforms to its own particular identity. Imperial power depends on the adherence of bodies to their supposed qualities or predicates in order to leverage control over them. My form of life does not relate to what I am, but to how, to the specific way I am what I am. In other words, between a being and its qualities, there is the abyss of its own presence and the singular experience I have of it, at a certain place and time. Unfortunately for empire, the form of life animating a body is not to be found in any of its predicates, big, white, crazy, rich, poor, carpenter, arrogant, woman, or French, but in the singular way of its presence, in the irreducible event of its being in situation, and it is precisely where predication is most violently applied, in the rank domain of morality, that its failure fills us with joy. For example, we come across a completely abject being whose way of being abject nevertheless touches us in such a way that any repulsion within us is snuffed out, and in this way proves to us that abjection itself is a quality. To embrace a form of life means being more faithful to our pensions than to our predicates. 6. Asking why this body is affected by this form of life rather than another is as meaningless as asking why there is something rather than nothing. Such a question betrays only a rejection, and sometimes a fear of undergoing contingency, and a fortiori, a refusal even to acknowledge it. Gloss alpha. A better question would be to ask how a body takes on substance, how a body becomes thick, how it incorporates experience. Why do we sometimes undergo heavy polarizations with far-reaching effects, and at other times weak, superficial ones? How can we extract ourselves from this dispersive mass of blue-mesk bodies, global Brownian motion where the most vital bodies proceed from one's petty abandonment to the next, from one attenuated form of life to another, consistently following a principle of prudence, never get carried away beyond a certain level of intensity? In other words, how could these bodies have become so transparent? Gloss beta. The most blue-mesk notion of freedom is the freedom of choice, understood as a methodical abstraction from every situation. This concept of freedom forms the most effective antidote against every real freedom. The only substantial freedom is to follow right to the end, to the point where it vanishes, the line along which power grows for a certain form of life. This raises our capacity to then be affected by other forms of life. 7. A body's persistence in letting a single form of life affect it, despite the diversity of situations it passes through, depends on its crack. The more a body cracks up, that is, the wider and deeper its crack becomes, the fewer the polarizations compatible with its survival there are, and the more it will tend to recreate situations in which it finds itself involved in its familiar polarizations. The bigger a body's crack grows, the more its absence to the world increases and its pensions dwindle. Gloss. Form of life means therefore that my relation to myself is only one part of my relation to the world. 8. The experience one form of life has of another is not communicable to the latter, even if it can be translated, and we all know what happens with translations. Only facts can be made clear: behaviors, attitudes, assertions, gossip. Forms of life do not allow for neutral positions. They offer no safe haven for a universal observer. Gloss. To be sure, there is no lack of candidates vying to reduce all forms of life to the Esperanto of objectified cultures, styles, ways of life, and other relativist mysteries. What these wretches are up to is, however, no mystery. They want to make us play the grand, one-dimensional game of identities and differences. This is the expression that the most rabid hostility toward forms of life takes. 9. In and of themselves, forms of life can be neither said nor described. They can only be shown each time, in an always singular context. On the other hand, considered locally, the play between them obeys rigorous signifying mechanisms. If they are thought, these determinisms are transformed into rules which can then be amended. Each sequence of play is bordered on either edge by an event. The event disorders the play between forms of life, introduces a fold within it, suspends past determinisms, and inaugurates new ones through which it must be reinterpreted. In all things, we start with and from the middle. Gloss alpha. The distance required for the description as such of a form of life is precisely the distance of enmity. Gloss beta. Every attempt to grasp a people as a form of life, as race, class, ethnicity, or nation, has been undermined by the fact that the ethical differences within each people have always been greater than the ethical differences between peoples themselves. 10. Civil war is the free play of forms of life. It is the principle of their coexistence. 11. War, because in each singular play between forms of life, the possibility of a fierce confrontation, the possibility of violence can never be discounted. Civil, because the confrontation between forms of life is not like that between states, a coincidence between a population and a territory, but like the confrontation between parties, in the sense this word had before the advent of the modern state. And because we must be precise from now on, we should say that forms of life confront one another as partisan war machines. Civil war, then, because forms of life know no separation between men and women, political existence and bare life, civilians and military, because whoever is neutral is still a party to the free play of forms of life, because this play between forms of life has no beginning or end that can be declared, its only possible end being a physical end of the world that precisely no one would be able to declare, and above all because I know of nobody that does not get hopelessly carried away in the excessive and perilous course of the world. Gloss Alpha. Violence is nothing new in history. We decadents are the first to know this curious thing, violence. Traditional societies knew of theft, blasphemy, parricide, abduction, sacrifice, insults, and revenge. Modern states, beyond the dilemma of adjudicating facts, recognized only infractions of the law and the penalties administered to rectify them. But they certainly knew plenty about foreign wars, the authoritarian disciplining of bodies. In fact, only the timid atom of imperial society, Bloom thinks of violence as a radical and unique evil lurking behind countless masks, an evil which is so vitally important to identify, in order to eradicate it all the more thoroughly. For us, ultimately, violence is what has been taken from us, and today we need to take it back. When biopower starts speaking about traffic accidents as violence on the highways, we begin to realize that for imperial society, the term violence only refers to its own vocation for death. This society has forged this negative concept of violence in order to reject anything within it that might still carry a certain intensity or charge. In an increasingly explicit way, imperial society, in all its details, experiences itself as violence. When this society hunts down violence everywhere, it does nothing other than express its own desire to pass away. Gloss Beta. One finds speaking of civil war repugnant, but when one does it anyway, they assign it a circumscribed place and time. Hence you have the Civil War in France, 1871, in Spain, 1936 to 1939, the Civil War in Algeria, and maybe soon in Europe. At this point, one should mention that the French, exhibiting the emasculation that comes so naturally to them, translate the American Civil War as the War of Succession. They do so to demonstrate their determination to side unconditionally with the victor whenever the victor is also the state. The only way to lose this habit of giving civil war a beginning, end, and territorial limit, this habit of making it an exception to the normal order of things, rather than considering its infinite metamorphoses in time and space, is to shine a light on the slate of hand it covers up. Remember how those who wanted to suppress the guerrilla war in Colombia in the early 60s preemptively gave the name La Violencia, the violence, to the historical period they wanted to close out. 12. The point of view of civil war is the point of view of the political. 13. When, at a certain time and place, two bodies affected by the same form of life meet, they experience an objective pact, which precedes any decision. They experience community. Gloss. The deprivation of such an experience in the West has caused it to be haunted by the old metaphysical phantasm of the human community, also known under the name Gemeinwesen by currents working in the wake of Amadeo Bordiga. The Western intellectual is so far removed from any access to a real community that he has to confect this amusing little fetish, the human community, whether he wears the Nazi humanist uniform of human nature or the hippie rags of anthropology, whether he withdraws into a community whose power has been carefully disembodied, a purely potential community, or dives headfirst into the less subtle concept of total human, through which all human fates would be total. It is always the same terror that is expressed, the terror of having to think one singular, determined, finite situation. This terror seeks refuge in the reassuring fantasy of totality or earthly unity. The resulting abstraction might be called the multitude, global civil society, or the human species. What's important is not the name, but the operation performed. All the recent inanities about the cyber communist community or the cyber total man would not have gotten off the ground without a certain strategic opportunity that opened up at the very moment a worldwide movement was forming to refute it. Let's remember that sociology was born at the very moment the most irreconcilable conflict ever witnessed. The class struggle emerged at the heart of the social, and this discipline was born in the very country where the struggle was most violent, in France in the second half of the 19th century. It was born as a response to this struggle. Today, when society is nothing more than a hypothesis, and hardly the most plausible one at that, any claim to defend the society against the supposed fascism lurking in every form of community is nothing more than a rhetorical exercise steeped in bad faith. Who, after all, still speaks of society, other than the citizens of empire, who have come, or rather huddled together against the self-evidence of empire's final imposition, against the ontological obviousness of civil war? 14. There is no community except in singular relations. The community doesn't exist. There is only community that circulates. Gloss alpha. Community never refers to a collection of bodies conceived independently of their world. It refers to the nature of the relations between these bodies and between these bodies and their world. The moment community tries to incarnate itself in an isolatable subject, in a distinct, separate reality, the moment it tries to materialize the separation between what is inside it and what is outside, it confronts its own impossibility. This point of impossibility is communion. In communion, the complete self-presence of the community coincides with the dissipation of all community within singular relations, and therefore coincides with its tangible absence. Gloss beta. All bodies are in movement, and it is immobile. A body still comes into presence, puts into play the world it bears and follows its fate. Certain bodies go together. They tend toward one another, lean on one another. There is community among them. Others flee one another, don't go together, and clash. Within the community of each form of life, there are also communities of things and gestures, communities of habits and effects, a community of thoughts. It goes without saying that bodies deprived of community also have no taste. They do not see that certain things go together, while others do not. 15. There can be no community of those who are there. Gloss. Every community is both an actuality and a potentiality. When it claims to be completely realized, as in total mobilization, or remain pure potentiality, as in the heavenly solitude of bloom, there is no community. 16. When I encounter a body affected by the same form of life as I am, this is community, and it puts me in contact with my own power. 17. Sense is the element of the common. That is, every event, as an eruption of sense, institutes a common. The body that says I, in truth, says we. A gesture or statement endowed with sense carves a determined community out of mass of bodies, a community that must itself be taken on in order to take on this gesture or statement. 18. When two bodies animated by forms of life that are absolutely foreign to one another meet at a certain moment and in a certain place, they experience hostility. This type of encounter gives rise to no relation. On the contrary, it bears witness to the original absence of relation. The hostis can be identified, and its situation can be known, but it itself cannot be known for what it is, that is, in its singularity. Hostility is therefore the impossibility for bodies that don't go together to know one another as singular. Whenever a thing is known in its singularity, it takes leave on the sphere of hostility, and thereby becomes a friend or an enemy. 19. For me, the hostis is a nothing that demands to be annihilated, either through a cessation of hostility or by ceasing to exist altogether. 20. A hostis can be annihilated, but the sphere of hostility itself cannot be reduced to nothing. The imperial humanist who flatters himself by declaring, "Nothing human is foreign to me," reminds us of how far he had to go to become so foreign to himself. 21. Hostility is practiced by different methods and with varied results. The commodity or contractual relation, slander, rape, insult, and pure and simple destruction all take their places, side by side, as practices of reduction. Even they understand this. Other forms of hostility take more perseverance and less obvious paths. Consider potluck, praise, politeness, prudence, or even hospitality. These are all what one rarely recognizes as so many practices of abasement, as indeed they are. Gloss. In his Le vocabulaire des institutions indo-européennes, Benveniste was incapable of explaining why the Latin word hostis could simultaneously signify foreigner, enemy, host, guest, and he who has the same rights as the Roman people, or even he who is bound to me through potluck, i.e. the forced reciprocity of the gift. It is nevertheless clear that whether it is the sphere of law, the laws of hospitality, flattening someone beneath a pile of gifts, or an armed offensive, there are many ways to erase the hostis, of making sure he does not become a singularity for me. That is how I keep the hostis foreign. It is our weakness that keeps us from admitting this. The third article of Kant's Towards Perpetual Peace, which proposes the conditions for a final dissolution of particular communities and their subsequent formal reintegration into a universal state, is nevertheless unequivocal in insisting that cosmopolitan right shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. And just recently didn't Sébastien Rocher, that unacknowledged creator of the idea of incivility and French fanatic of zero tolerance, that hero of the impossible republic, didn't he give his most recent March 2000 book the utopian title, The Society of Hospitality? Does Sébastien Rocher read Kant, Hobbes, and the pages of François, or does he simply read the mind of the French interior minister? 22. Anything we usually blanket with the name indifference does not exist. If I do not know a form of life, and if it is therefore nothing to me, then I am not even indifferent to it. If I do know it, and it exists for me as if it did not exist, it is in this case quite simply and clearly hostile for me. 23. Hostility distances me from my own power. 24. Between the extremes of community and hostility lies the sphere of friendship and enmity. Friendship and enmity are ethico-political concepts. That they both give rise to an intense circulation of affects only demonstrates that affective realities are works of art, that the play between forms of life can be elaborated. Gloss alpha. In the stockpile of instruments deployed by the West against all forms of community, one in particular has occupied, since around the 12th century, a privileged and yet unsuspected place. I am speaking of the concept of love. We should acknowledge that the false alternative it has managed to impose on everything, do you love me or not, has been incredibly effective in masking, repressing, and crushing the whole gamut of highly differentiated affects, and all the crispy, defined degrees of intensity that can arise when bodies come into contact. In this set of false alternatives, love has functioned as a way to reduce the extreme possibility of an elaborate working out of the play among forms of life. Undoubtedly, the ethical poverty of the present, which amounts to a kind of permanent coercion into coupledom, is due largely to this concept of love. Gloss beta. To give proof, it would be enough to recall how, through the entire process of civilization, the criminalization of all sorts of passions accompanied by the sanctification of love as the one true passion, as the passion par excellence. Gloss omega. All this, of course, goes only for the notion of love, not for all those things it has given rise to, despite itself. I am speaking not only to certain momentous perversions, but also of that little projectile, I love you, which is always an event. 25. I am bound to the friend by some experiences of election, understanding or decision that implies that the growth of his power entails the growth of my own. Symmetrically, I am bound to the enemy by election, only this time a disagreement that in order for my power to grow implies that I confront him, that I undermine his forces. Gloss. This was the brilliant reply of Hannah Arendt to a Zionist who, after the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and during the subsequent scandal, reproached her for not loving the people of Israel. I don't love peoples. I only love my friends. 26. What is at stake in confronting the enemy is never its existence, only its power, its potentiality. Not only can an annihilated enemy no longer recognize its own defeat, it always ends up coming back to haunt us, first as a ghost and later as hostis. 27. All differences among forms of life are ethical differences. These differences authorize play in all its forms. These kinds of play are not political in themselves, but become political at a certain level of intensity. That is, when they have been elaborated to a certain degree. Gloss. We reproach this world for not going to war too ferociously, nor for trying to prevent it by all means. We only reproach it for reducing war to its most empty and worthless forms. 28. I am not going to demonstrate the permanence of civil war with a starry-eyed celebration of the most beautiful episodes of social war, or by cataloguing all these moments when class antagonism achieved its finest expressions. I'm not going to talk about the English, Russian, or French revolutions, the Magnovishina, the Paris Commune, Gracchus Babeuf, May 68, or even the Spanish Civil War. Historians will be grateful. Their livelihoods aren't threatened. My method is more twisted. I will show how civil war continues, even when it is said to be absent or provisionally brought under control. My task will be to display the means used by the relentless process of depoliticalization that begins in the Middle Ages and continues up to today, just when, as we all know, everything is political. Marx. In other words, the whole will not be grasped by connecting the dots between historical summits, but by following a low-level, unbroken, existential sequence. Gloss. If the end of the Middle Ages is sealed by the splitting of the ethical element into two autonomous spheres, morality and politics, the end of modern times is marked by the reunification of these two abstract domains as separate. This reunification gave us our new tyrant, the social. 29. Naming can take two mutually hostile forms. One wards something off. The other embraces it. Empire speaks of civil wars, just as the modern state did, but it does so in order to better control the masses of those who will give anything to avert civil war. I myself speak of civil war and even refer to it as a foundational fact, but I speak of civil war in order to embrace it and to raise it to its highest forms. In other words, according to my taste. 30. I call communism the real movement that elaborates everywhere and at every moment civil war.